Any community that shares life together is going to hold some things in common. Like they have shared experiences and shared stories. The things that have happened to us or that we did together, and the tales that we tell about those things, right? And sometimes those things match up and maybe they don't exactly, but that's not the point. The point is that we hold them together and they bind us together into a community. Or a community usually has shared language and some sorts of shared rituals. The sorts of things that we use as shorthand to describe what's meaningful or maybe to remind us of some of those stories we tell. So like in the church, and church itself is one of those shorthand words that holds a lot of meaning. We have things like baptism or the Lord's Supper, or we have language like atonement or sacrifice, or even the word love, which has certain shades of meaning in our community, things that we hold in common in our understanding about those things, or the way we use those words, or the way that we practice certain types of behaviors, those are the things that bind us together. We know that we hold something in common in those things. One of the most important things that we can hold together as a community is mission, a sense that we share a purpose. In the book of Philippians, which is a book that has a lot to say about what it means to do life together, Paul spends a lot of time talking about that shared sense of purpose or mission. In the first chapter, the second half of the chapter, he has several different points where he talks about that. Like in verse 12, where he says, what has happened to me, and he's talking about being in prison and having to suffer. He says, what has happened to me has actually served to spread the gospel. You hear those notes of mission? Or a little bit further down in verse 18, when Paul's talking about the way that he's encountered opposition, he says, what does it matter? Just this, that Christ is proclaimed in every way. See, he's pointing towards the shared mission that they have in common. Or in verse 20, Paul is talking about his expectation, the hope that he has. And he says ultimately that hope is expressed, that Christ would be exalted as always in his body, whether by life or by death. See, in all of these texts, Paul is pointing towards the mission that he shares with the church in Philippi, the common purpose that they have. That the gospel would be proclaimed and spread, that Christ would be announced to the world, and that in the way that Paul lived, he would give testimony through the things that happened to his body. He would give testimony and be a witness to who God is in the world, who Christ is, who Jesus is, towards the mission that they have together. All those things are expressions of the shared purpose that the church has. And I'm convinced that not only did Paul share those things with the Philippian church, but that he shares them with us, the church alive right now. That if Paul was here right now and was writing us a letter, that it would say something like that he wasn't concerned about whatever was happening to him, because he would be hopeful that it was working, that it was serving to spread the gospel, that Paul would use whatever circumstance he was in as an opportunity to spread the word of Jesus. Or that if he encountered suffering in some way, that his hope in that suffering would be that Christ would be proclaimed in some way. Or that in his hope for what would happen in the long run, that he wouldn't necessarily focus on whether a situation would turn one way or another, but just that the result of it would be that in his body, Christ would be exalted. That whatever happened to him would be for the glory of God. I know that that's what Paul would say about himself if he was undergoing the same kind of situation we are right now. And I know that he would hope the same thing for us too. That whatever it is that's happening to us would serve to further the mission of God in the world, so that Christ would be exalted and proclaimed, and that people would hear the testimony about what God was at work doing in the world, and that also that in the middle of all that, we would see the gospel bearing fruit. I believe that's a part of the shared purpose that we have with Paul way back through time. And I know that it's the thing that we hold in common with each other that is the foundation of our life together. We have shared experiences and stories and language and ritual and lots of other things that we hold in common. But most importantly, we share purpose and mission because we're bound together by the call of Jesus Christ. And that is the call that brings our salvation, but is also the call that sends us out into mission so that we too have a way of giving witness to God, of sharing with our words and expressing through our deeds what God desires to have done in the world, which is revealed to us in Jesus and then is handed off to us, we who live as his disciples, so that we too may participate in God's mission in the world. I am delighted to hear stories about people from Cedar Lane or people who have connected to us in different ways who are seeing the gospel bearing fruit even in this time, even in the middle of this coronavirus crisis and all that comes with it. I'm so delighted to hear stories like somebody who's found opportunities of neighbors who they know are suffering and can't get out much, and so they've taken upon themselves to go get groceries for them and leave them on their door, just so as a way of expressing the love of Christ for that neighbor. Or somebody else who's found that there were people that they knew that they were connected to who were experiencing loneliness, and so they've reached out and made an effort to go maybe have a conversation from the other side of the porch, or maybe to make sure they make a few extra phone calls and do a FaceTime and figure out a way that they can express their love for their people, for their neighbors, for their brothers and sisters. Or maybe, some people that have found the opportunity in this moment to take advantage of this digital church stuff that we're doing and to send an invite to somebody who they hoped would receive the gospel of Jesus. Or sometimes maybe even to be in a space. Like I've heard of a young woman from our church who was, at work and had this, worked for the police and was driving around and had the sermon playing on her phone as she was taking criminals to jail, and they were hearing the gospel, okay? And let me tell you, those are all expressions of our shared mission together. And isn't it great that even in this moment of crisis, that Christ is still being proclaimed, that the love of God is still being shown, and that whether by word or deed, people are still finding ways to work on mission together. Listen, I know that we share lots of great stuff, okay? It's the part of the great thing about church is all the stuff that we share. Sometimes when we share food together, we have great potlucks, or sometimes we share space together, or sometimes we share certain kinds of experiences together. But right at the center of it is the mission that we share in the name of Jesus. And every single person is a part of that. We share that stuff together across the whole body of the church. Because if Jesus has given us salvation, he has also given us a mission. If Jesus has given you salvation, if Jesus has given you grace, he has also called you into his mission. That's kind of the way it works. And some people are called to take that mission into distant lands. So sometimes people are called to go all the way to the other side of the world to help spread the news of Jesus. And some people are called, like the Samaritan woman, to go back into the community in which they lived and to share the word of Jesus there. Like the man who was healed from the legion of demons. Jesus said, go back to your community, to your friends, to your family, and you tell them what God has done for you. Sometimes our mission is something that's expressed in words. Sometimes it's expressed by kindness and love and service. Sometimes it's expressed by taking a stand. Sometimes it's expressed by just being merciful to someone. But however it takes form, all of those things are part of that central thing that we share, the mission of God together. A little bit later in that first chapter of Philippians, Paul says to them, he says, live your life in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ. What a challenge, right? To live life, not just to do a certain set of mission tasks, but to live life in a manner worthy of the gospel. And then he goes ahead and says, no matter how whether he hears about them because he's absent or whether he sees them face to face, he will know that they are standing firm in one spirit, striving side by side with one mind for the faith of the gospel. And I think that's where we're at right now. In fact, we're in a moment where many of us aren't able to meet face to face, and it might be like that for a while. But whether we meet face to face or whether we're absent from each other, let us live in such a way that we can give encouragement to each other, so that we can know that our brothers and sisters, wherever they may be, are standing side by side with us in the Spirit, working for the mission of God that Jesus has called us into. May the Lord be with you this week as you go, even if your going looks a little bit more like staying, as you go as missionaries of the gospel of Jesus. Amen.